Well, hi there. This is Anu, and today I am so excited to be speaking with two dear friends, teachers, mentors, Sebene Selassie and Dan Harris. I've known them both for, Sebene for 2 decades, almost 2 decades, Dan for almost a decade. And they've both been leading the charge on really introducing mindfulness-based tools into our world. If you don't know who they are, I'd love to just read a quick word about them. And then I invite you both to just share a little bit about yourselves too, outside of these words that I read. So Sebene Selassie is a writer, teacher, speaker who leads meditation, creativity, and nature-based practices for personal and collective liberation. She's a devout student of mystic traditions, including astrology, and writes the popular newsletter Ancestors to Elements. Her first book, You Belong, A Call for Connection, is published by Harper One, and I highly recommend it. It's one of my favorites. And then Dan Harris is the author of the New York Times best-selling memoir, 10% Happier, about fidgety, skeptical news anchor who finds meditation. He's also the host of 10% Happier podcast. That's how I originally met him. And the co-founder of the 10% Happier meditation app. For 21 years, he's worked for ABC News, where he anchored such shows as Nightline and the weekend editions of Good Morning America. So thank you both, first of all, for joining me at this Breaking Bias Summit. I'd love for each of you to share a little bit about yourselves outside of your professional accolades and all the do's of the world. But who do you be outside? Who are you? And a little bit about your story. Dan, would you like to start?
I always defer to Sebene.
Well, thank you, Anna. It's really great to be here with you both, and congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
Very excited for it to come out in the world. It's beautiful. I was born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in 1970, and we moved to the U.S. when I was 3 years old. So I very much identify as an immigrant, even though I grew up here. I grew up in an immigrant home, so I often call myself an immigrant weirdo because I never quite felt like I belonged in this culture or anywhere, because I don't feel like I belong in Ethiopia or Eritrea either. I'm half and half. So that's definitely a big part of who I am. I also love the arts, and I am getting comfortable with calling myself a collage artist. I make collages for my newsletter, and I really love doing that. And I do love all the arts, including theater and music. And one of the reasons why I love living in New York and Brooklyn is being able to access that really readily. And I love dancing. I'm a big nightlife kind of person, except now that I'm old, it's daytime life. I go to tea dances, which are afternoon dance parties.
I love those.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thanks, Sebene. And Dan?
Tea dances. What it like? Is that's like a 4 in the afternoon tea time?
Yep.
Shake your booty.
Yeah, they're really fun.
What's the average age, and how many like do not resuscitate bracelets are there?
It's actually really mixed, and there are some that are all ages. So people bring like their kids, usually at the beginning, and then it gets kind of crazy, and so then it's more of the young folks. But my favorite ones are really actually quite varied in age and culture, and yeah, they're really fun.
That's great. I love that. I'm learning something new already. I'm a dad, husband. We have one. My wife and I, Bianca and I, have one son who's 9. We have 4 rescue cats, which is one or two too many. What else can I say? I read a lot of novels. Actually, Sebene got me back into novels. I was reading for many years, for like 5 or 6 years after my first book came out. I was reading mostly just like Dharma books, and which are great, but I forgot how much I love novels. And then Seb sent me a novel in 2020, the Richard Powers book. What was that called?
The Overstory?
The Overstory, right. And that book got me back into reading novels. So I read a lot of novels. I watch a lot of TV. I love movies. What else can I say? I play the drums.
Oh wow, I didn't know
So
that.
does my son. We play together. Mostly he complains about practicing, so I play his drum set. Yeah, there you go. A little bit.
That's sweet. Yeah, I saw your son at the event in New York City, and he led this loving kindness practice, which was quite powerful. I was like, wow, let's start him early, and very much appreciated that. One of the questions I had for each of you is that why did you say yes to coming on the summit and speaking about this topic? You know,
I mean, because I like you.
yes. Beyond that, that's a given. I would hope.
I know the work that I've known the work that you do for a long time, and actually seen you in action. We served on a board together and did some of this work together, and I just know the power of it. And I actually remember when we were first doing some of this unconscious bias, breaking bias work on the board that we were on. There was someone on that board who is a medical doctor and who was learning some of these facts for the first time.
Yeah.
I think at that point was probably in their 40s and did not know this research, did not know this field really of understanding. This is a mindfulness practitioner and teacher. And to see someone like that being impacted really was profound for me, because I also have been, knowing this work and doing this work for a while, but because of kind of the milieus I'm in, I had never seen that kind of like live consciousness change happening. I could see the synapses connecting for this and seeing what kind of impact that they would have.
Yeah.
Was really it was quite profound. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's so interesting, right? Because I've kind of trained and been around a lot of doctors, medical doctors, and the number of physicians in our country who don't know that race is a biological fiction, it's just a story, is mind-boggling, right? They're like, oh no, of course there's biological differences between Black and white people or people of different races. But yeah, it's basically the miseducation. And when like it clicks, it's like, oh wow, that's clear. So now where do we go from here?
It's amazing how deep that is, because there are people who realize, okay, there aren't these big biological differences, but they'll still try and have an argument with you.
Yeah.
I gave an unconscious bias presentation at a conference that was mostly for medical professionals. This is years ago now, and this one doctor at the end, whose son is a Dharma teacher, was kind of arguing with me about, well, there's this, well, there's that, and that what he was really describing, like sickle cell, is really cultural and geographic. It's not real, right? And so it's really incredible to see the progress that still needs to be made.
Yeah, thank you for that. Dan, what made you want to say yes? Why is this important to you?
Well, like Seb, because I like both of you. So in terms of why I'm interested in this subject, well, first of all, I've done some amount of this work, much of it with Sebene. And I'm kind of interested in why it's so kind of toxic in some important circles in our world, and whether I can use my platform and just like kind of who I am to make it a little bit less controversial and more interesting. And also, I always like to lead with what's in it for me, like the selfish case for doing things. And so I don't know if I'm all the way there yet, but I've been thinking a lot about how to talk about working with our biases in a way that doesn't come off as preachy or virtue signally or too far to the left, but more like, this is a thing you do if you were interested in peak performance and quality relationships, which of course are related. Never mind being a good citizen.
Yeah, no, that's so great. And one of the things I always like to ask people is how do they feel about bias in our society today? Not think, but really kind of moving into that somatic space of feeling, because that word that you mentioned, Dan, toxic, right? That's kind of an association we often have with these conversations. What does that feel like in the body, for you and Sebene, whoever wants to kind of respond to that?
It doesn't feel safe.
Doesn't feel safe.
No, this does not feel like a,
Yeah.
this feels like a very risky place to go. And I'm attracted to things like that, frankly.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's hard to think about getting this right in a way that can, reach the largest number of people. Because I
Yeah.
think too often these discussions are preaching to the choir. And so
Mhm.
I'm very interested in talking to people who might otherwise, reflexively reject it. And that's risky, tricky.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. And that's the type of conversations we want to be having, because it all begins with a conversation. And this idea of lack of safety is huge, right? Because if you don't feel safe, we can't be ourselves and our nervous system shut down. So yeah, thank you for that. And then how would you feel? Yeah, go ahead.
Just to jump in on that, sorry, I sorry to interrupt you, but I think, and this is something Seb and I have kind of debated repeatedly over the years. I am very persnickety about language because I think language matters a ton when you're talking to people who might be tempted to reject this stuff. And even the word safety is tricky because a lot of people will associate that with, college campus snowflakes or whatever. That's not my language, the language of the skeptic. And so I think a lot about trying to find the right words
Mhm.
that don't send the signal to the brain of my interlocutor or my audience that you're about to get lectured or shamed or
Yes.
yeah. So again, I don't know that I have this down, but I think about this a lot.
Yeah. Thank you. 7A.
Yeah, I mean, Dan has really helped me think about this because I think your continual pointing of that out has led me to be really much more careful about my language. And it's not that those words, whatever words are going to be sort of signals for some people that this is not safe, or safe being an unsafe word, or
Yeah.
whatever it is, that it's a signal to them that it's not a conversation they want to be a part of.
Yeah.
Even if those words are true and accurate, I try and not use sort of those key words and find another way to say it now, so that I can sort of reach everyone. Rather than kind of dog whistling, it's sort of whistling a tune that everybody can sing along with so that they can understand. Or sometimes I like to say, like, if I go into a room and everyone speaks French, I don't start speaking English because they're not going
Right.
to understand me. And so really thinking of my work, which is not exactly the same as yours, Anu, but it's adjacent in terms of the types of things that I'm talking about, belonging and the paradox of belonging, and how to talk about that in a way that is reaching as many people as deeply as possible. So not just watering it down just to reach the masses, but really finding ways to hit these, profound points of connection to as many as I can, and preaching beyond the choir.
Yes. I think that's a key point about not watering it down. Because that is, I don't want to be misunderstood. That is not what I am espousing. I think it's about communicating this in all of its richness and complexity,
Yeah.
but in a way that the people who aren't listening start listening, because you can
Yeah.
have this conversation in our circles as much as you want, but I'm not sure how much of a difference it makes, unless
Exactly.
we're talking to people who, are tuning this out. And I think they're tuning it out for reasons that we should pay attention to.
Mhm.
So what have you found useful and helpful in having those conversations beyond like the choirs of the world, because that I feel like is the work of breaking bias. How do we invite more people in and, you know, offer them safety and compassion and empathy? Yeah, if you have any examples, that'd be really useful. You know,
Is that to me or Seb?
either one of you, because you both.
Well, I think, Dan, you are really good at this. So I'd love to hear your response. Maybe I can piggyback off it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm writing about this in my next book, which Seb has been helping me with and advising me on. And I don't think I have it fully down yet. So with
Yeah.
that caveat, I'll say a few things. One is to avoid sanctimony. A role model for me in this regard is a character from a TV show called Letterkenny. This is a great Canadian sitcom that I got into during the pandemic, but is not widely known. But it's a very funny show about life in rural Canada. And one of the characters' name is named Squirrely Dan, and he's this very large, overall wearing, flatulent man who does not know how to conjugate verbs very well. He drinks a lot of beer, gets into fights. He's a very sort of lovable, coarse individual. And every once in a while, Squirrely Dan will tell his buddies, his beer drinking buddies, about what he learned in his women's studies class. And
That's awesome.
it's really funny, and he does it in a way that everybody listens because of who he is and because of the lack of self-righteousness in his delivery. And I find that really, really compelling. And so that's one thing. I think the second thing is, you know, that's related to this is, you know, is trying to be careful about language, not careful about language in a way that seems too careful and precious, but just talking like a normal fucking person, and not using this sort of woke boilerplate. And you know, and again, I think I use that word woke with some hesitation because I think that is an example of on the other side how people have taken a really helpful term from Black culture and warped it into an epithet. But so having said that, being very careful about not using words that have fairly or unfairly been ground into meaninglessness or controversy through the meat grinder of our toxic public discourse. So I think it's you know, again, words like woke, which the first time I heard it, I thought was just such a brilliant term and kind of Buddhist in a deep way.
Yeah, exactly. We're waking up.
Yes, exactly. The Buddha means awake, and so, but it has now, again, for some pretty unfair reasons, become a provocative term, and so like just knowing that and trying to navigate this unfair, unfortunate landscape with some skill. I think a third thing is being very open about my own biases. You know, just being honest about the fact that I've got plenty of biases. I have not broken my biases. I'm still captured by them in many ways. I'm just trying to be as open as possible to them. And I think that normalizes it for people and makes them feel less shame. It's like I still make stupid mistakes all the time, or get caught up in cultural ideas that were implanted into me through my family or, you know, TV and movies that are completely unfair. And then the fourth thing I would say is as I said before, thinking about this in terms of what is the self-interest of my audience, and instead of putting this into you know, finger wagging, you ought to do this exhortation from the mountaintop type of thing. More like, yeah, if you want to learn how to make better decisions and have better relationships with people, which again will help you make better decisions and be more effective. These are interesting things to look at, and they are tractable. They are workable. So why not? And by the way, I guess this is the fifth thing. The work itself, even though it's tough, as our mutual friend Ruth King likes to say, it's messy at best. It is super interesting, and humbling and all of that. But it's really interesting to get a sense of the way the mind works, and to not take it so personally, and to not get coiled up in shame, which is a kind of like psychic constipation that stops you from
Yeah.
dealing with the thing. So anyway, I just rambled a little bit, but those are 5
Yeah.
angles.
I love that. And I think one of the things about the fourth angle is also how one can improve their relationship with themselves. Because
Yeah.
one of the first places where bias begins is just internalized biases, the ways we limit our own potential. And, whether we think we're worthy or not, whether we think we're capable or not of doing some of the most simplest and basic things. Yeah, no, I think that's really useful. And, to that point around communication, one of the things I always think about around mindfulness and awareness of language is I have like a pretty simple rule around skillful communication, was whether whatever I say is, truthful, useful, timely, and kind. It's a very like simple Dharma hack. Um, have you all used that at all? And Sebene, if you'd like to comment on this, and how has that, shaped the way you've, brought your language into this type of work, particularly around belonging. I noticed in your book, like that was like a consistent theme over and over again when I was reading it. And it really inspired me to be like, oh yeah, like this is a way of being in the world, right? Where we could actually cause harm through our language, even though it's in service of equity. So how do we balance this desire for equity and belonging, and yet simultaneously do it from a place of non-harming?
Yeah, I think there's a lot there, and also even in what Dan said that points to what a inside job it is, and that means that it's not easy, because we are having to have a pretty in-depth level of self-awareness in order to do that, and that is a simple term, but it's not a simple task. And so cultivating these practices of understanding what's happening within us, like what our intentions are, what's coming out of our mouths, being able to reflect on it, being able to then make amends for things that we've said. Dan and I have had public conversation about challenges we've had in our own relationship around some of these issues. And so to be able to do that for ourselves and with each other is really important. And that takes practice. It takes a self-awareness, meditation, mindfulness, whatever you want to call it, but it takes some kind of self-awareness practice that each person is going to have to develop for themselves. And then it takes relational practice as well. That's interpersonal relationships. And then not to mention community. And if we're doing public work, then with our audiences. And so it can get pretty complex pretty fast. I think one thing I'd like to name is something when Dan was talking about, sort of these groups, whatever we want to call them, left or right or conservative or progressive, but that idea that there's sort of an other side is something that I've been really trying to work on myself in terms of bias. And I remember someone saying at a meeting once, and I can't remember his name. He's a Lama who lives in Santa Barbara. He's mixed race, African-American. One of you might remember, but do want to give him credit for this. But someone was talking about, taking a side, and he said, no, it's not about taking a side. It's about taking a stand. And that character you described from that show reminded me of the show Reservation Dogs, and the orphan character, young kid who is he's sort of the most kind of woke person of the four of them. Often just introduce himself and give his pronouns, or explain how someone is but he does it in this totally unself-conscious way that is just in a very nondescript way, taking a stand. And it's not about this side or that side, but it's about living from this place of real authenticity, but integrity. And so I've been really considering that and moving through the world, not taking sides and really trying not to see sides at all. And living this truth of the paradox that I'm always talking about, is that we're not separate and we're not the same. And to really try and understand that from a lived perspective, not just a theoretical or conceptual idea. And to do that means that yes, then I will speak with more kindness and with more attention to being understood, and really let go of this need to dominate or to create a new kind of hierarchy through this work,
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
we're the ones who know and other people don't, like to bring everyone along for this really important process of waking up together. And so how to do that day to day is my practice.
Amen. And, you know, I grew up in a Hindu Buddhist tradition, right? So this idea of non-dualism was like present in my household growing up day in and day out. You know, and oftentimes when I would say that, well, you know, create these binaries of us and them, you know, I'd be reminded by my grandma that there is no them, there's just us, right? Ultimately, the people you think are them are more like you than unlike you. You just have to kind of wait and reflect on that. Um, and, you know, for me personally, it was something that, you know, our society conditions in these dualisms, right? These us and thems all the time. And the process of breaking through these barriers that we've created ourselves that are socially erected is the work of breaking bias. But, you know, it can feel so charged, right? What Dan, you were talking about, this can feel so charged, it can feel so toxic, it can feel so um, unsafe, right? The word that you use, lack of safety. So for me, it's actually really playful. It's really exciting because we get to play together, particularly with friends we haven't played with before. Um, but what would it take for us to actually make that leap? You know, particularly in the audiences and communities you work with, where you feel that lack of safety. How do we introduce that joy and play in it in order to kind of bring, you know, some shift, you know, inner and outer?
Well, I would just say that we have to feel it ourselves first. Like it can't
Yeah,
just be for the sake of that, right? It has to
yeah,
be an experience of that. I mean, I love the work Dan and I are doing together with our friend Jeff Warren to bring more joy and playfulness into meditation. And so we have these series of podcast episodes and now workshops, like weekend retreats, where we really do invite that joy and humor and even irreverence. And
yeah, yeah,
irreverence doesn't mean having no reverence or awe for what should have reverence and awe.
yeah,
It means having irreverence for being, you know, uptight about this work, which is not needed. And so it's called meditation party. We really are trying to make it a
oh,
party, like to make this deep work of waking up something that's fun and joyful and inviting and yeah, we have to feel that first.
yeah. That's awesome. How do you feel that? You know, what do you do to feel that in your, what practices have you used to kind of really bring that joy to yourself?
Shit talking each other, I think, right?
That's great.
I mean, honestly, shit talking is a lost art, it feels to me, you know, and especially in this place of bias, you know. I mean, it feels like there have been times in our culture where we've been better at this, you
Mm.
know. And you know, in my friend group, there's a reasonable amount of difference, and what gives it that crackle, which is what I've always loved about um, knowing diverse people in a workplace or in a social setting, or is the shit talking, you know, taking risks,
Yeah.
saying things that are inappropriate, and like all of that that seems to have evaporated in a pretty significant way, and I think that is a huge loss.
Do you think that's generational? Like, I think you're both around the same age or Gen Xers. And I find that I'm a millennial. And then when I'm with Gen Z, like I have to like adapt my behaviors, my speech in certain ways. Have you found that at all that, you know, it could be generational or is it just culture wide?
Yeah, I think there's probably some I don't want to shit talk the younger generations, first of all, because they're a product of the world we made for them.
Yeah.
And also, I think there are incredible things about Gen Z and the millennials. So I'm
Thank
not
you.
like cranky, get off my lawn, old white man. That's not the role I want to play. But I do think, yes, it seems like there is a little bit less of a sense of humor about this now, and culture wide, and I think in part generationally. And I don't know what is exactly causing that. You hear, I mean, just a couple days ago, Frank Bruni came out, and the New York Times columnist, and talking about how is there something about the education system that has produced a kind of Manichaean us versus them, a colonialist versus victim mentality.
Mhm.
I don't know enough to say whether that's true, but that's at least one theory that's out there. Yeah, I don't. I think another thing is social media. And again, I'm not anti-technology. I use social media, but I think there are some negative externalities for sure. And one of them is
Sure.
that anybody can take anybody down, and there's a sort of pile-on effect that can happen. And so, and you get social capital and clout by being the first person to help ruin somebody's public reputation, and sometimes that's a good thing, and a great way to return power people who might not have it. But it also can have it can take the air out of the room,
Yeah.
and make and create a kind of an atmosphere where it doesn't feel safe to have a sense of humor about this stuff. Yeah, let me just use a name that I know is going to be controversial. I'm not co-signing
Yeah.
on his recent comments or anything like that. But if you go back and look at the Chappelle show in 2003 and 2004 and
Mhm.
5, like that show had embodied the spirit that I'm talking about, where it was really
Yeah.
funny, and they were playing with he was stomping on the third rail, just
Yeah.
not just touching it, just stomping on it in ways that, again, I'm not fully down with some of his more, recent stuff, but that show really had that spirit that I'm trying to, I mean, that
Yeah.
I'm pining for.
It's fascinating, right? Because, generationally, I think for me, when I watched that show, it did irk me quite a bit when I was watching it. So I wasn't a huge fan. And that's what I hear from a lot of younger people too, that um, I think whenever they're appearing antagonistic, my experience has been it's really rooted in pain, like
Yeah,
their personal experiences of
yeah.
pain and feeling marginalized and othered and excluded and beaten on and bullied. And so I feel like it's almost like it's like a call to action. It's like an invitation to be like, hey, tell me more. What happened? Right. And I know personally for me, I didn't have those opportunities. There not very many people ask me like, what happened to you? Why are you so angry? Because I used to be that angry activist who would go up, and I didn't call people out because that was never um, my way of being. But I think it was something I took on. So I wonder if there's like some bridge building that's needed now, um, as like we're operating in our own like mental bubbles, right? And what you found funny, which is I'm sure it was super funny, and I think many people did. That's why he was so widely successful. And there are people who didn't find it funny, and how do we kind of bridge that divide? And how do we build those bridges? Sebene, I see you thinking.
Well, I just think humor's hard because humor, maybe all things, is very generational
Yeah.
and cultural. And so, not that we can't meet on humor. Something that I sort of try and stand by, of course, with probably frequent mistakes, is I've seen people fail with humor in public, and
Yeah.
usually because they're making fun of someone else. And if you're making fun of someone else, you're going to be making fun of another culture usually.
Yeah.
And so I try and only make fun of myself.
Exactly.
Part of the humor, and everybody will find that funny because I'm so much of a mess that it's easy to make fun of myself. So, but to come back to sort of something where we started, and I think in this, especially in terms of cancel culture and this dynamic, is to me really about power, because people have been disempowered. don't necessarily know how to work with power. And so when power is then gained, there can be this real clumsy misuse.
Yeah.
And that is, it's a hard thing to talk about in a context where someone who's empowered is criticizing someone who's generally been disempowered for their use of power. But it's a messy conversation that you have to have, because everyone can misuse power. It doesn't matter where they are in the circle or in the hierarchy, that's something that all of us have to learn. And I think this understanding that we are on a very absolute fundamental level, not separate, that there is this core non-dualism, helps us work with power in a much more balanced or nuanced way, because we fundamentally will understand that we're harming everyone when we do that.
Yeah.
That's a great point. It's a great point. Let me just go back to humor for 1 second. That I do think having a sense of humor, especially about yourself, is incredibly important. It is not, it's necessary, but not sufficient. So if that's all you're doing, I don't know how far that gets you. And so I think the bridge building that you were calling for, Anu, is key. And I think it's incumbent, most especially upon the people who have the power. And so I would put myself in that category. So I think, I guess I'm just responding to your comments with a yes and.
Yeah, I love it. And I think this is where kind of you get to the juicy part of, well, so how do we get there, right? What's the solution? Like, people are like, well, how do I do this? What's the fix? And for me, it's mindfulness. It's these contemplative tools that we've practiced for ourselves and others. And would love to kind of first, like, hear your relationship with mindfulness. Like, how did you come to it? And what are your daily practices? In the book, I talk about the PRISM toolkit. So PRISM is 5 tools that scientists have shown to be efficacious around, of course, all sorts of benefits to self, but also to social healing, to building trust, to breaking stereotyping and biases in our minds, perspective taking, pro-social behaviors, individuation, stereotype replacement, and mindfulness. But ultimately, what these tools are things like all of the mindfulness practices we do, from the body to the feelings to the thoughts to various forms of loving kindness and other pro-social behavior practices. So yeah, what rule, like, how do we kind of, not how, but how have these tools helped you, and what role can they play in bridge building in our world?
Can I go back?
Yes.
I'll use your question to just something that Dan said, because you said, Dan, that you identify as someone with the power, and I really appreciate that. And I think what I was pointing to is sometimes you don't have the power, and I might have the power, and I could misuse the power towards you, which is the conversation we had on your podcast, where I unknowingly, because I wasn't, consciously trying to harm you because you're my friend, I wouldn't do that. But I had, because of something, maybe, I mean, you can link to this podcast episode if you want to.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I had kind of trying to be humorous, again, like humor failing, used race in a way that was actually harmful towards Dan. And I was in a position of power there as the Black person, talking about race, talking about Dan. And so, that it requires a level of interrelational mindfulness, right? Because I wasn't aware, and then Dan called me and made me aware, and I had to, instead of going into reactivity or shut down, I had to actually be aware of what was happening in me. And I told him, oh wow, I'm really nervous, my heart's beating really fast, this is uncomfortable. And so it takes that level of practice to be able to know what's happening with you. I'm not saying I always do that. I mean, talk to my ex-husband. Like, there are plenty of times that I'm like shut down, reactive, ornery and combative. But we aspire to have that level of relationality that includes awareness, kindness, compassion, level of communication that really hears the other person so that we're listening, and then communication that's authentic and clear when we're speaking. So that's a tool that's not just about like a meditation practice, but mindfulness is
Yeah.
that we use in relationship.
It's so beautiful that the way you kind of described that you became aware of it, but sometimes our friends, right, make us aware of something we're not aware of. That's basically unconscious bias. So yeah, I'm really curious to hear that episode, and we'll definitely link that here. But Dan, do you have any thoughts on what Seb just shared in that particular instance?
I wish I had recorded the phone call because it was like a master class on Seb's part of like, it's very hard to take feedback. And I have failed to take feedback in a constructive way so many times. And I'm sure I will continue to do that. I can easily get into defensiveness, and so Seb just didn't at all. She went right into sort of reporting on what was happening for her, and then talking in a very, I found, effective way about what had been in her mind when she said what she said. It was just awesome, I thought. Yeah, but it does kind of get back to safety. I mean, I felt comfortable with Seb after knowing her for quite a while. I felt comfortable enough with her to bring this to her and talk about it with her. I mean, I remember something Seb said to me at lunch one time years ago. I mean, this would have been like 2016 or 15. She said, you can say whatever you don't have to worry too much because I'll never kick you out of my heart.
Yeah.
And so if somebody says something like that to you, it has a molecular impact, I think. And that's not the feeling most of us have moving through the culture these days on these issues. And I'm not just speaking now from the perspective of a white person. I think the vast majority of us, no matter what our pigmentation or background or sexual orientation is, feel on edge. And so it's not a conducive environment to successful conversations.
Yeah. And what's the role of self-love here? Sorry, go ahead, Seb.
Sorry, I don't remember saying that, but I'm going to write that down. And, I wish we could all move through the world with that attitude towards everyone, right?
Yeah.
That should be the starting point, not just the end point, right?
Yeah. And I think for me, when that happens, when like someone just call me out, I feel that in my body very much like you, Seb, and kind of call it out, like, oh, I'm feeling tension in my chest and my shallow breathing, long exhales. I go through that whole, awareness practice. And then ultimately what I come to is this sense of self-loathing, like I did something wrong. I am wrong. I'm unworthy, right? And that was a practice for me for years, like when I would be in conflict with family members, with friends, with, colleagues, work colleagues, clients. And over time, I saw that this was really rooted in this like lack of self-love.
Yeah.
Right. So if someone is actually calling me out or, criticizing me in some way, they have the right to, right? I am not here to tell them that they're wrong. Rather, I'm here to listen. But what part of me accepts what they're saying about me or their projection of me? And that's kind of the work of awareness and mindfulness, that I feel the two of you did on that call. But yeah, like that kind of brings me to this idea of like, what is the role of compassion? Not just compassion for others, for self-compassion in this work. And because for me, like that's where it really begins in terms of breaking bias. Because sometimes we feel like we are wrong because of our dominant identities or subordinated identities across the board. And
I mean, I think something you just said there just points right to it when you're describing what happens to you when you're receiving feedback. Sometimes a big pitfall is shame, which is filled with ego because you're making it a story about yourself. One of the expressions that I learned from Seb that helps you cut right through this is, you think you're thinking your thoughts, but you're actually thinking the culture's thoughts, which I believe comes from J. Krishnamurti. But Seb was the one who pointed it out to me, and in a very helpful way that make me realize that, the more mindful I am, the more I see how inappropriate and unfair the thoughts flitting through my mind are. And there's a way in which you can see those thoughts and then revert to a story about how I'm hopeless, I'm irredeemable, I'm X, I'm Y, but that's just story. Instead of seeing that these thoughts are, they don't originate with you, you pick them up along the way from the culture or your parents or wherever, and then it's workable. But the pitfall is getting into shame, because then nothing can happen. But if you can view it as not your fault but your responsibility, then it's like, okay, yeah, it's not my fault I'm having these ridiculous, unfair, unspeakable thoughts. It's my responsibility not to be owned by them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that's where the research that you bring in, Anu, into your work is really helpful, because sometimes we're having responses to the world and we may think we're crazy, but it's actually because the structures are crazy.
Yeah.
Like, for example, I, have had many interactions with the medical world because of my cancer, and I've been in ERs many times, and I never knew about the high levels of bias. I mean, I knew about bias towards Black people, but I didn't know about, the lag time in delivering painkillers, the not believing Black patients. Like, I just wasn't aware of that. And I remember a particular time, this is years ago, where I was in an ER, and I was in so much pain. It turns out that I had a or almost bursting appendix, but the nurse would not give me painkillers. And it wasn't till years later, an ER doctor that I met told me that they have little tags that they put on people's, codes in the system to identify them as, frequent flyers. And because I had come to the hospital so many times, like, I was sort of tagged as someone who's drug seeking. Well, of course, it's usually Black patients that are tagged that way. Regardless, there's no other reason to categorize them as this, will receive painkillers at a way less rate than white people, just because they're race. And so you can think I remember getting angrier and angrier at this nurse, and really feeling afterwards like it was my fault. And it wasn't until years later that it put together that, you can feel like just this angry Black lady, but you're actually experiencing bias. And so it's so complex to understand the world and understand ourselves and understand these dynamics with that level of compassion,
Yeah. And, for me, and I thank you for sharing that. And I'm so sorry that happened to you, because it's such a common occurrence for particularly Black patients, but, patients of many other marginalized identities too. And I always think about it from the perspective of that nurse, right? Of course, it's terrible what's happening to subjugated, who is a person of color or not, because we're all part of the same collective consciousness, right? But did she wake up that day wanting to be like, I'm going to be the most biased nurse in the world today?
Right.
Probably not, right? She went in to serve her patients. And yet, because of the way, what I call bias, learned habits of thoughts that distort how we perceive, reason, remember, and make decisions. So these learned habits are what's distorting her from seeing the humanity of others in their fullness. And this is where I think our opportunity is to really wake people up, maybe not be woke given the publicity and the marketing around this word, but it's really about waking up to our common humanity and how we be best to ourselves and others.
Yeah. How do I not kick that nurse out of my heart too?
Yeah.
It's the systems that stink.
Yeah. Like, she should have been trained by her nursing school, her residency programs, her medical institutions. And they failed her too, in a way. It's like a whole.
Can I just give one more example?
Yes, please.
So recently I was looking upstate, as Dan knows, I've been looking to try and buy something upstate, and a friend came along with me, but I was the person, and my friend is Latina, but she's very light skinned. She looks white, and the real estate agent, me and my friend, I'm looking for the house. Multiple times when we would encounter another real estate agent, they would immediately and only talk to my friend.
Yeah.
Just immediately assuming, and never even looking at me. And this happens all the time. I went to a pharmacy recently with my best girlfriend who's Japanese American or Canadian, and the pharmacy person knew I was picking up the prescription, but spent the whole time talking to her. And my friend was like, I finally just started looking at the ceiling. So I was like, why are you looking at me? She's got a prescription. But it's just unconscious, you know, it's really unconscious, and it just happens all the time. And if we ourselves aren't aware, experiencing that bias or expressing that bias, that this is a part of how these systems work, it frays on people, and it leads to a lot of terrible reactivity.
So can I ask you a question, a follow-up question? Because, you know, a lot of people that are watching, listening to this are likely Black and brown and have probably shared your experiences, Sebene. How have you coped with that? You know, the invisibility, the microaggressions, you know, in these day-to-day interactions, you know?
You know, I think naming it is really important, not pretending like it doesn't exist. And so I feel validated in friendships and in communities where it is named and acknowledged and processed. I think recognizing them as parts or results of systems that live within and around us. So, you know, I'm going to keep coming back to this. I love it. My long ago statement that I'm reclaiming of not kicking people out of your heart. So not sort of attacking the other person, and knowing when to kind of address it and not. I don't need to address it with every waitress or real estate agent or, you know, pharmacy person. Like that's not going to change anything, because it's an unconscious experience that it's not something that, you know, I can solve by blowing up at someone for sure, but even trying to explain it to them, because they're not necessarily going to understand. So I'm not going to speak French to someone who doesn't speak French, you know? Just really not taking it personally, and showing up with integrity for myself and in the places where I need to.
There's like just such a largeness of spirit, heart, mind, whatever you want to call it there, and that I honestly don't know if I was in your position whether I'd be able to muster. But and we know, but I believe there's some data to show that, you know, people in marginalized communities, I mean, that there are compounding pernicious health effects from just dealing with this level of, you know, day to day.
It's called weathering.
That I don't deal with. And I just be curious, Seb, do you think what I'm calling here this largeness, this generosity on your part, is also there might be some self-interest, or what the Dalai Lama might call wise selfishness here, of you might be less weathered as a result of this attitude than somebody who didn't have it?
Yeah, there's definitely some self-protection in not continually raising my cortisol levels. Yes. Yeah. And I think that's true for many people, right? That it's just like, you know, Black folks are some of the chillest folks you'll meet.
Yeah, for a reason. Or indigenous people too, like some of the native folks I've met.
Yeah.
Well, that does kind of bring us back to humor, because I mean, if you watch Reservation Dogs, or read a Louise Erdrich book, or know anything about African American culture, humor, or Jewish culture, you know, frankly, which I do know a little bit about from the inside, that, you know, humor really comes in an authentic way, and it seems to me to be healing and self-protective.
More so than just being really uptight and like really wound up all the time. I don't know.
That's something I know about.
Angry and judgmental. You know, it's also really interesting what you shared. It reminded me of two things. One, that by practicing that largeness that Dan said, or that generosity of spirit toward others who may have harmed us consciously or unconsciously, we're also protecting our telomeres, right? Telomeres are what keep, they deteriorate over time. They're responsible for aging. And science has shown that the more we practice mindfulness and compassion and these tools of contemplative sciences, we, protect ourselves from aging and sickness. But simultaneously, we feel good. One of the things I used to do when those types of instances happened to me, not to that extreme, Seb, is, when we do loving kindness, we start with someone we love and slowly move to, neutral parties, to people we kind of sort of dislike. I created a category of like frenemies, who were basically people that are friends, but then they often do things that harm us, or they're supposed to be friends, but sharing those same like, well wishes toward them. And I saw that helped me really kind of shift my own perspective toward them, and also their perspective toward me, strangely. So I don't know if you've seen that ever work, if you've like practiced loving kindness or any one of these practices toward people you don't like, and their behavior toward you has changed. Have you experienced that, or that's just me?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that this stuff is definitely contagious, and that it's energetic, and that same categories of groups of people we described, they're also the most soulful people you'll meet. And there's something really deep in an understanding of just kind of this, again, non-dual sacred interconnection that is undeniable. It's scientific as well. And so there's a recognition of that comes from having that bigger perspective and that sort of larger container.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome. Well, this was such a fun conversation. Thank you both so much for being here. I'd love to invite you to share, how, and any like tips and tools that you may have for audiences around this work, and also anything else you'd like to share with them as calls to action.
I think we've said so much about how this is an inside job. And so there's a lot to be gained from reading and from learning that you can find out there, but the work also has to come from within. So doing the things to understand ourselves, understand our own reactivities, also understand our bigness and celebrate that. And that can come through meditation, but I've also been really helped by therapy, by trauma work, by body work. That mindfulness is the capacity, but there are many techniques to get there, not just meditation.
Also dance. Daytime dancing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Seb. Dan?
Two things have been helpful for me that come to mind. I'm sure the list is longer, but one is, Sebene, in a course I was taking with her, recommended that you do this little exercise where as you're walking through the street or walking through the world, just kind of try to be mindful of the unbidden thoughts that are racing through your mind as you see people. That's a very humbling thing. I found it to be useful. And the second thing is just loving kindness practice. I believe there's some data to show actually that it can reduce bias. I've heard about some studies where people in the brain scan who have done a non-trivial amount of loving kindness, like the same regions of the brain fire when they're looking at pictures of themselves as when they're looking at pictures of other people. So you really just start to kind of understand on a gut level the non-separation. And I found it particularly helpful, this practice, in terms of not only, warming up my inner weather vis-a-vis other people, but also toward myself, so that when somebody inevitably points out when I've been a schmuck, I'm less stuck in the shame of it, less defensive, less stuck in that, and more able to see it as, okay, well, that was an unskillful thing. I don't need to turn it into a whole big story about myself.
Yeah. That's so beautiful. No, and I think it's just the power of these practices. That's why they've survived 2,500 years. So Well, thank you both so much for your time and generosity of spirit and to talk about breaking bias with me today. And yeah, we look forward to staying in touch,
Yeah, thank you, Anu. Congratulations again.
Thank
Yes,
you.
congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.